in America. Can you see the affinity today of what it was in the worst time in Rome? One writer said a long time ago that if you don't study history, you're bound to repeat it. Now during the deportation, let's see, I've got down here, you have to read the footnotes in so many. I always read the footnotes more than I do the text sometimes in a history book. It says, sums up the scattered statements of Josephus and makes out the total number killed from the beginning to the close of the war to 1,356,460. And those that were enslaved were 101,700. 101,700 that were carried off. But the Jews went all over. Wherever a Jew has gone, wherever the land that his foot has touched, God has blessed him. You know that? When I was in Israel from December to May, I guess it was 75 and 76. One thing we were talking to, I talked to a lot of Arab doctors. They were archaeologists. And they did not like the Jews. See, we don't like the Jews, but whatever their foot touches, it blooms. God bless them. Wherever their foot touches, whatever they do, we're blessed. They were blessed, and they had food. You know, the Jews were not farmers, really, were they? But when they went back into the land of Israel, after World War II, you know, even God used Hitler to make them want to go home. And you know what, Larry, do you remember the displaced person ships? You ever hear about the displaced person ship, the DP ships? They would take these people, they took a lot of Jews out of Poland, all over the place. They had them in these ships, and they, just like the boat people of Vietnam. They would go, and they would go off and basically anchor offshore, and they had a lot of Jews on ships over there, displaced persons in the Mediterranean. They're off the shore of where Tel Aviv is now. And they just jumped off the ships and started swimming to shore. Over there, they wanted to go home. And they had the culture going there. They had groups from all over the world donating, or they could go in there and buy land, and they had these kibbutz. By the way, Bernie Sanders is a Jew. And he's a communist. Jews are communists. And, but it's a different kind of communism. It's more true communism, more true socialism, without all of the amenities that go with it in Canada, and even creeping in America today, and Russia, and China, places like that. He was over there in a kibbutz, and he tried to be a carpenter for a while, but he says manual labor is for idiots. He doesn't believe that people that have to do manual labor or have any worth in society at all. And that's why he became a politician, so we wouldn't have to work. But that's the truth. He was over there in a kibbutz, and basically he left it. But he wants to bring that culture to America today. The number of Jews during the apostolic age is estimated between 20 and 30,000 souls. They all spoke Hellenistic Greek with a strong Hebrew accent. They had, as far as we know, 7 synagogues and 3 cemeteries with Greek and with a few Latin inscriptions. Sometimes with the Greek words in Latin letters, or Latin words in Greek letters. And they inhabited 14 regions beyond the Tiber, the Trastevere. Now we begin, see, we got this much text here, and then we got that many footnotes. And the footnotes are written in several different languages. The enormous, ever-changing turmoil of the population from all lands, like in America, then confusing, intoxicating commotion of a truly cosmopolitan intercourse, the number and magnificence of public parks and buildings, the immeasurable extent of the city. Now, we have some people coming in here that started ghettos. And the Jews lived in ghettos many times. They supplied all types of commerce to them, to people, whatever they needed. They had so what we call bank. You know, when you have a what we call a hawk shop, and they would loan money on real property, whatever it was, a family heirloom or whatever. And they made immeasurable commerce in these cities, and they become rich. And it goes on into German here, and I won't read that. By a combination of certain data comes conclusive that Rome, under Augustus, AU 749, there were 668,600 people, exclusive of slaves, and 70 or 80 years later, from 1.5 to 2 million. When all of this happens now, we have problems sometimes. We know from Josephus that 8,000 Roman Jews accompanied a deputation of King Herod to Augustus, and that 4,000 Jews were banished to Tiberias, or by Tiberias, to the mines of the salt mines, basically. But those data do not intensify a very definite calculation. And then we go into German again, then we go into Greek, then we go into Latin. You have to read these languages. I'm still familiar enough with Latin and German that I can read it. They publish newspapers, mostly in Greek, but sometimes in Latin. At the base of Genecleum, probably also the island of Tiber, a part of the left bank towards the Circus Maximus and the Palatine Hill, or the neighborhood of the present ghetto of Jewry. The present ghetto of Jewry. They were mostly descendants of slaves and captives of Pompey and Cassius and Antony. They dealt then, as they do now, in old clothing, broken ware, rose from poverty to wealth, and in prominence as bankers, physicians, astrologers, fortune tellers. Fortune tellers. Now, just think about that for a minute. Here we have a culture of people that say they believe in God, but they copycatted paganism. In the pagan temples, you would go in there and out, and you go up there and you take your request to a priest, and you had to stay in line, long lines. It was kind of a church. But you went up there, and if you were going to go invest in a business, if you had some lost money someplace that had been stolen, if you had an uncle that might have died on the road coming to meet you, if you had a mother or father in some land and wanted to know how they were, you went up there and you gave your request to the priest. And then he would take that request and he would give it to a hag. A hag. H-A-G, hag. An old hag? You've heard of old hag. But he'd give it to a hag, and this hag would be suspended in a chair or a basket over a cavern that went down deep in the earth. And what she was doing, according to them, is she is getting messages from the underworld, the hinderworld. Okay? And she would talk to them in an unknown language, and by the power of their gods, they would interpret it. Now, this is where you talk in an unknown tongues comes from. It didn't come from the Bible. And they would charge large sums for these answers. Well, yes, I want to start a pottery business over here. It's going to work. Yeah. My uncle Jim died, and he left money someplace, but nobody knows where his beard was. It's over there underneath the post in that field. And they give them the correct answers, by the way, because we're really dealing with the dark underworld. Now the Jews, the tarot cards, you've heard of tarot cards. All of this stuff comes from Jewry. The palm readers, all of this is from Jews. And they went into these places and they practiced this soothsaying. Remember the witch of Endor with Saul, King Saul? The strange manners and institution of the Jews. Yet they carried on this mystical, paganistic practice of soothsaying. They were bankers, they were physicians, they were astrologers. Astrology is not good either. Astronomy, you study the stars. Astrology is you get answers from the stars. And fortune tellers, palm readers. Not a few have found their way to the court. In other words, they found their way up in politics. Alitharus, a Jewish actor, enjoyed the highest favor of Nero. Who was that famous actress in Europe?
Bernhardt?
Sarah Bernhardt. Sarah Bernhardt was a Jew. She was trained to be a prostitute. She had two sisters, and all of them were trained to be prostitutes, courtesans. And they went into the most fancy courts, the highest courts in Europe, and they would seduce princes. Sarah Bernhardt had a child with a prince, and they would open up political asylum for them in these areas. A Jewish actor enjoyed highest favor of Nero. Thallus, a Samaritan and freedman of Tiberius, was able to lend 1,000,000 denarii to the Jewish king Herod Agrippa. The relations between the Herods and the Julian and Claudian emperors were very intimate. The strange manners and institutes of the Jews, as the circumcision, the Sabbath observance, abstinence from pork and meat is sacrificed to gods. Now they would do all these ungodly heathen practices, and yet this is where the religion was. It wasn't a change of heart. It was a society of what they called righteousness, not of heart change. It didn't deal with anything with the heart. It was an outward religion, not an inward religion. Yet that they would die for it. The Sabbath observers, abstinence from pork and meat sacrificed to gods whom they abhorred as evil spirits, excited and mingled amazement and contempt and ridicule of the Roman historians and satirists. Whatever was sacred to the heathen was profane to the Jew. They were regarded as enemies of the human race. The Jews were regarded as the enemies of the human race. But this, after all, was a superficial judgment. The Jews also had their friends. Their indomitable industry, persistency, their sobriety, their earnestness, their fidelity, their benevolence, their strict observance of the law, their disrespect for death in war. They were not afraid to die at all. their unshaken trust in God, their hope of glorious future of humanity. They wanted to change the world. Now Christianity went out and Jesus said you can change the world. If everybody was saved, we know they won't be. Look at America. America was founded on God. Now it's founded on heathenism. The simplicity and purity of their glorious future of humanity, the simplicity and purity of their worship, the sublimity and majesty of the idea of one omnipotent, holy, and merciful God made a deep impression upon thoughtful and serious persons, and especially upon females who escaped the odium of circumcision. Now, what it's talking about here, in the Arab world today, in the Muslim world today, all the females are supposed to be circumcised. And what they do is they cut their clitoris out. They say it makes them more chaste. They have no feeling that way to touch themselves, and so that's what it's talking about. These women wanted to become Jews because the Jews didn't circumcise their women. They circumcised the men. The circumcision of men, and today a girl, an Arab girl or a Muslim girl, has got to be circumcised. They send them back to India, send them back to Arabia or someplace to visit home, and they come back circumcised. They're mutilated. Hence the large number of proselytes in Rome and elsewhere of women. Horace, Persius, Juvenal, as well as Josephus testify that many Romans abstained from all business on the Sabbath. The blue laws like we had in America. Now, the Sabbath was never Sunday, people. The Sabbath was never Sunday. It's always been Friday evening to Saturday evening. That's the Sabbath. Constantine tried to change it, and later on we had another pope changed it to Saturday to Sunday. But the Sabbath is still today from Friday evening to Saturday evening. They fasted, they prayed, they burned lamps. They studied the Mosaic law. Well, the Mosaic law, there is righteousness in it, isn't it? And there is cultural exchange in there. How do you deal with people? You don't cheat them. You're honest, etc. The Mosaic law sent tribute to the Temple of Jerusalem. Even the Empress Pompeia, this woman has got quite a history, Pompeia, was inclined to Judaism after her own fashion and showed great favor to Josephus, who calls her devout and God-fearing, even though she was a cruel, shameless woman. Seneca, who detested the Jews, calling them Scalarius Ideologens, a generation of twisted people, that's Latin, was constrained and said that this conquered race gave laws to their conquerors. The Jews were twice expelled from Rome under Tiberius and Claudius. Now Tiberius, you know, his son-in-law was who?
Peter. Who
was Tiberius' son-in-law, one of his son-in-laws? Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was a believer in Jesus. We have in his letter, and we have in other historical events, history confirms the letter of Pontius Pilate to Tiberius Caesar. And they hated the Jews because they killed him. He called them a wretched, twisted people, just like it said here in Latin. And Tiberius was angry with them. They gave liberty to the Christians, but soon returned to their Transalpine quarter and continued to enjoy privileges of the religio licita, which were granted them by heathen emperors, but were afterwards denied by Christian popes. The popes came in there, you know, that's the Catholic Church began when? When the Catholic Church began. It didn't begin at the seashores of Galilee, it didn't begin there at Pentecost in Jerusalem. It began in 325 AD under Constantine. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Pompeia. this is quite a deal. It's all in footnotes, see. You got to read the footnotes. And like I said, half of it, I'm going to have to translate some of it for you. So, Pompeius Sabina, the wife of Otho, was the fairest woman in her time in the whole Roman Empire. She was more beautiful than any woman. She was the most beautiful woman there. But sometimes pretty is as pretty does, huh? Sometimes pretty is as pretty does. But let's look at her now. The charms and beauty, she combined the address and accomplished intriguer. Among the desolate women of imperial Rome, she stands preeminent. Originally united with Rufus Crispius, she allowed herself to be seduced by Otho. Allowed herself to be seduced. She was married before to Rufus Crispianus. Then she takes off with Otho, but obtained a divorce in order to marry him. Introduced by this new connection to the intimacy of Nero, she was soon aimed at a higher elevation, but her husband was jealous and vigilant, and she herself knew how to allure the young emperor by alternate advances and retreats, till in the violence of his passion he put his friend out of the way by dismissing him to the government of Lusitania. Poppaea suffered Otho to depart without a sigh. The second husband. She profited by his absence to make herself more and more indispensable to her paramour, and aimed with little disguise at releasing herself from her new union and supplanting Octavia by divorce or even death. Octavia now. Nero accidentally kicked Pompeo. Now that's not true. Nero married her also. This was one of Nero's wives, this Pompeo. Now remember, she practiced Judaism. Okay, but now she's going from man to man to man to man to man. Whoever can get her to the highest position, of course, Nero was it. He was a Caesar. And so, and it tells you that he accidentally kicked her. He didn't accidentally kick her. He was in a rage. She was pregnant with his child. He was crazy in love with her, but he went into fits of rage, just manic episodes. And in one of his manic episodes, he kicked her in the stomach, and she not only aborted the child, but she died. Now, we read the Romans, the first chapter a while ago, didn't we? What did it say about homosexuality in there, the wickedness of it. So now, she had a beautiful face and figure. It just so happens that there was a young man there that looked a whole lot like her in her features. He had that boy castrated, and he made him his lover because he looked like his wife. Boy, this is some wicked stuff, isn't it? In a state of pregnancy, she died and pronounced her eulogy from the rostrum. The Senate declared divine honors to this Pompeia. Victus Victoribus Legas Dederont, quoted Augustine. The word received a singular illustration a few years after Seneca's death, with Bernice, the daughter of, became the acknowledged mistress of the first of the Vespasian rulers, and then his son Titus. This is Bernice. And presided in the palace of the Caesars. Titus promised to marry her, but was obliged by the pressure of the public opinion to dismiss her, incestuous adulteress. Again, it goes into Latin and into Greek. And the history of the Roman ghetto, the word derived from G'day in Hebrew. See if I can write it up here in Hebrew if I got a place, I guess so. G'day. That's Hebrew. The Roman ghetto is a word derived from gedah, to cut down, to emasculate, presents a curious and sad chapter in the annals of the papacy. The fanatical Pope Paul IV, 1555 to 59, calls it to be walled in and shut out from all intercourse with the Christian world, declaring in his bull, "It is the most absurd and unsuitable that the Jews, whose own crime has plunged them into everlasting slavery, under the plea that Christian magnanimity allows them to assume and dwell amongst Christians, not hearing any mark of distinction, and should have Christian servants, yea, even buy houses." He said that they could not own slaves, and they cannot own property. Sextus V treated the Jews kindly in the plea that the family from which the Christ came. When Paul arrived in Rome, he invited the rulers of the synagogues to a conference. There were a lot of synagogues in Rome. Remember, there were a lot of Jews there, and they were a powerful people, even though they were looked down upon, but they were beneficial. That he might show them his goodwill and give them the first offer of the gospel. But they replied his explanations with shrewd reservation, and affected to know nothing of Christianity except that it was a sect everywhere spoken against. The best policy was evidently to ignore it as much as possible. Yet a large number came to hear the apostle on the appointed day, and some believed, while the majority usually rejected the testimony. There was Christianity in Rome now. Christianity in Rome. Our Father, we thank you for this message. Thank you from your history and from your word, that we might know about the world we live in today better, that we might not make the same mistakes that they did in history. And Father, please use your word wherever it goes to save souls by the gospel of your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Please forgive me where I've